Chapter 1. A Mysterious Door. Mr. Utterson was a lawyer. He was a serious and quiet man. He did not smile often, but he was kind. People trusted him because he was honest and fair. He was not interested in parties or fun. Instead, he liked to help people when they were in trouble. Even though Mr. Utterson was serious, he had many friends. He did not choose his friends because they were fun or interesting. He liked people for who they were, even if they had problems. One of his closest friends was a man named Mr. Richard Enfield. Every Sunday, Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield took long walks together. They walked through the streets of London and talked about many things. Sometimes they talked about their work, and sometimes they talked about strange things they had seen. Even if they did not always agree, they liked each other's company. One Sunday, as they were walking, they passed through a small, quiet street. It was a nice street, with clean houses and bright windows. The people who lived there took care of their homes. The doors were painted and the gardens were neat. But in the middle of this beautiful street, there was one strange building. It was old and dark. The windows were shut and the door looked damaged. The paint was peeling and the house looked abandoned. Mr. Enfield stopped walking and pointed at the building. "Look at that house," he said. "It reminds me of a very strange story." Mr. Utterson was curious. He turned to his friend and said, "Tell me the story." Mr. Enfield looked serious. He took a deep breath and said, "One night I was walking home very late. The streets were empty and everything was quiet. Then I saw a man walking quickly. At the same time, a little girl was running down the street. She was in a hurry. Maybe she was afraid of the dark. Then something terrible happened." Mr. Utterson listened carefully. "What happened?" he asked. Mr. Enfield continued. "The man and the girl ran into each other, but instead of stopping or saying sorry, the man knocked her down. He did not care. He stepped on her and kept walking. The little girl screamed in pain." Mr. Utterson's face became serious. "That is terrible," he said. Mr. Enfield nodded. "Yes, it was." The poor girl lay on the ground crying. Her family heard her and ran outside. They were very angry. I was angry too. I ran after the man and caught him. I told him he must come back and help the girl. Mr. Utterson asked, "Did the man fight back?" Mr. Enfield shook his head. "No, he did not fight. But he was very strange. His face was hard to describe. He looked normal, but something about him was wrong. When I looked at him, I felt cold inside. I felt like I had seen something evil." Mr. Utterson was interested now. "And then what happened?" Mr. Enfield said. "The girl's family was very upset. They wanted to call the police, but the man did not want trouble. He said he would give them money. We took him to that house over there." Mr. Enfield pointed at the old broken house. "He went inside and came back with some money, but something strange happened. The money was from a famous man's bank account. It was not his." Mr. Utterson's eyes narrowed. "That is strange indeed." Mr. Enfield lowered his voice. "Before he left, I asked the man for his name. He told me his name was Mr. Hyde." Mr. Utterson's face changed when he heard that name. He looked at the door of the old house. He had heard the name Hyde before. But where? As they walked away, he said to himself, I must learn more about Mr. Hyde. Chapter 2. Mr. Utterson's Worry. That night, Mr. Utterson could not sleep. He lay in bed thinking about Mr. Hyde. The story Mr. Enfield told him was disturbing. Who was this man? Why did he act so cruelly? Finally, Mr. Utterson got up from his bed and went to his desk. He took out an old piece of paper. It was Dr. Jekyll's will. He had read it before, but now it felt different. The will said, if Dr. Jekyll disappears or dies, all his money and property will go to Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson frowned. He had never liked this will, but Jekyll had insisted on it. At the time, he thought it was strange, but now it seemed dangerous. Mr. Hyde was not a good man. Why would Jekyll trust him? He thought. Is Hyde blackmailing Jekyll? Is Jekyll in danger? Mr. Utterson needed answers. He decided to visit his old friend Dr. Lanyon. Dr. Lanyon's warning. The next afternoon, Mr. Utterson went to see Dr. Lanyon. Lanyon was also a doctor and had been friends with Dr. Jekyll for many years. He was a cheerful and friendly man. Mr. Utterson sat in Lanyon's study. Lanyon, do you know a man named Mr. Hyde? He asked. Dr. Lanyon shook his head. No, I have never heard of him. What about Dr. Jekyll? Have you seen him lately? Dr. Lanyon's face changed. He sighed. Jekyll and I do not talk much anymore. We used to be close, but he has changed. He has strange ideas now. He does things I do not agree with. I don't know what he is working on, but I do not like it. Mr. Utterson left Lanyon's house feeling even more worried. He still had no answers. Waiting for Hyde. That night, Mr. Utterson made a decision. He would wait outside the old building where Mr. Hyde lived. He wanted to see this man with his own eyes. The street was dark and empty. The houses were quiet. Mr. Utterson stood in the shadows, watching the door. Hours passed. He was cold, but he did not leave. Finally, he heard footsteps. A man was walking toward the old building. He was small and dressed in dark clothes. There was something strange about the way he moved. Mr. Utterson stepped forward. Are you Mr. Hyde? He asked. The man stopped. His face was pale. His eyes were small and sharp. He looked at Mr. Utterson with suspicion. Yes, my name is Hyde. How do you know me? I am a friend of Dr. Jekyll, Utterson said. I have heard about you. At the mention of Jekyll's name, Hyde gave a strange smile. It was not friendly. It was cold and unpleasant. Dr. Jekyll is not here, Hyde said shortly. Then he took out a key, opened the door, and went inside. Mr. Utterson stood there for a moment. He felt uneasy. That man is dangerous, he thought. I do not trust him. Dr. Jekyll's house. The next day, Mr. Utterson visited Dr. Jekyll's house. The house was large and beautiful, but part of it connected to the old, dark building where Mr. Hyde had entered. Jekyll's servant, Poole, opened the door. Is Dr. Jekyll home? Mr. Utterson asked. No, sir, Poole said. He is not seeing anyone today. Mr. Utterson hesitated. Then he asked, Does Mr. Hyde come here often? Poole nodded. Yes, sir. He has a key. Dr. Jekyll told us to follow Mr. Hyde's orders. Mr. Utterson was shocked. Jekyll trusts Hyde too much, he thought. Why would he let this man control his house? As he walked home, he felt even more worried. I must help Jekyll, he thought. Mr. Hyde is dangerous. Something is wrong. I will not stop until I find the truth. Chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll's Dinner Party. 2 weeks later, Dr. Jekyll invited some of his friends to dinner at his house. It was a pleasant evening. The guests were mostly doctors, lawyers, and important men from the city. They sat at a long table, enjoying delicious food and fine wine. Everyone was in a cheerful mood, talking and laughing together. Mr. Utterson was also there. He watched Dr. Jekyll carefully. Jekyll looked well. He was a handsome man, tall and strong, with a kind face. He was friendly and polite, speaking warmly to his guests. Looking at him, it was hard to believe that he was connected to someone as terrible as Mr. Hyde. After dinner, the guests slowly began to leave. They shook hands with Jekyll and thanked him for the lovely evening. Soon, only Mr. Utterson remained. Dr. Jekyll smiled at his old friend. "Come, Utterson, let's sit and talk," he said. Mr. Utterson was glad to have some time alone with Jekyll. He had been worried about him ever since he heard about Mr. Hyde. He had to talk to Jekyll about it. He waited until they were sitting comfortably. Then he said, "Jekyll, I must speak to you about your will." Dr. Jekyll's smile disappeared. His face became serious. "I do not wish to talk about that," he said quickly. "But I must," Utterson insisted. "I have seen Mr. Hyde. I have heard terrible things about him. People say he is cruel and violent. Why have you given him everything in your will?" Jekyll looked away. He did not answer immediately. He seemed troubled. Finally, he sighed and said, "My dear Utterson, I trust you more than anyone. But I cannot explain this to you. It is a private matter. You would not understand." "Jekyll, I am afraid for you," Utterson said. "That man is dangerous. I believe he has some power over you. Is he blackmailing you? Is that why you are protecting him?" Dr. Jekyll suddenly looked up. His face showed surprise, then sadness. "No, no," he said quickly. "I am not in trouble. I promise you that. I can stop seeing Mr. Hyde any time I want." Mr. Utterson was not convinced. "If that is true, then why does your will say that if you disappear, Hyde will take everything you own?" Jekyll stood up and walked to the fireplace. He stared into the flames for a long moment. Then he turned to face Utterson. "I cannot tell you everything, my friend," he said. "But I will tell you this. There is a reason I have done this. It is not because I am in danger. It is not because I am afraid of Hyde. You must trust me. One day, you will understand." Utterson shook his head. "You do not have to tell me everything," he said. "Just promise me one thing. If something happens to you, if you disappear, let me handle things. Change your will so Hyde does not get everything." Dr. Jekyll thought for a moment. Then he smiled, though it was a sad smile. "I promise you this, Utterson," he said. "If something happens to me, I will take care of it myself." Mr. Utterson did not like this answer, but he knew Jekyll well. Jekyll was stubborn. He would not say more. "Very well," Utterson said, standing up. "I hope you know what you are doing, Jekyll, but if you ever need help, you can come to me." Dr. Jekyll patted his friend on the shoulder. "Thank you, Utterson. But do not worry. Everything will be fine." Mr. Utterson left the house, but he did not feel any better. He walked home slowly, deep in thought. "Jekyll is hiding something," he thought, "and I do not believe everything will be fine." The night was cold and quiet. The street was empty, but deep inside, Mr. Utterson felt uneasy. Something was very, very wrong. Chapter 4. The Murder. 1 year later, a terrible crime happened in London. It was a foggy night. The streets were dark and quiet. A servant girl was looking out of her window. She enjoyed watching people walk by. That night, she saw 2 men in the street below. One man was old and kind-looking. He had white hair and walked with a cane. The other man was small and strange. He moved quickly, like he was nervous. The girl looked closer. Suddenly, she gasped. She had seen the small man before. It was Mr. Hyde. She remembered hearing terrible stories about him. At first, the 2 men seemed to talk politely. The old man smiled and pointed at something in the distance. But then, something changed. Hyde suddenly became angry. His body shook, and his hands clenched into fists. The old man stepped back. He looked surprised. He tried to calm Hyde down, but Hyde did not listen. Without warning, Hyde lifted his heavy walking stick and hit the old man on the head. The old man fell to the ground, but Hyde did not stop. He hit him again and again. The servant girl screamed and covered her eyes. She could not watch. When she looked again, the old man was dead. Hyde stood over the body, breathing heavily. Then he suddenly ran away into the darkness. The girl was shaking. She quickly called the police. The investigation. The police arrived soon. They found the dead body of Sir Danvers Carew, a respected man. He had been beaten terribly. His cane was broken into 2 pieces. One piece was missing. The police searched his pockets. They found a letter addressed to Mr. Utterson. One officer said, "Mr. Utterson is a lawyer. Maybe he knows something about this man." They went to Mr. Utterson's house and woke him up. Mr. Utterson's suspicions. When Utterson heard what had happened, he was shocked. "Sir Danvers Carew? Murdered?" he asked in disbelief. The police gave him the letter they found in Carew's pocket. Utterson read it. Then he looked at the officer and said, "I think I know who did this. Follow me." He led the police to Mr. Hyde's house in a poor part of London. The street was dark and empty. Hyde's house was small and dirty. A woman opened the door. She was Hyde's maid. "Is Mr. Hyde home?" the officer asked. The woman laughed. "No, sir. He has not been home since last night." The police searched the house. Inside it was messy. There were papers and clothes on the floor. It looked like Hyde left in a hurry. Then, they found something important. A broken walking stick. Mr. Utterson gasped. "I know this stick. It belonged to Dr. Jekyll. The police also found a burned checkbook in the fireplace. Hyde had tried to destroy it, but some pages were still readable. The officer said, "This man must be hiding. We will search the city and catch him." Dr. Jekyll's strange behavior. Mr. Utterson went straight to Dr. Jekyll's house. He wanted to know why Jekyll's cane was at Hyde's house. Poole, Jekyll's servant, opened the door. "I must see Dr. Jekyll," Utterson said. Poole looked nervous. "Sir, Dr. Jekyll is not well. He has locked himself in his room and refuses to see anyone." But Mr. Utterson insisted. Finally, Dr. Jekyll came out. He looked pale and weak. "Utterson," he said, "I swear to you, I will never see Hyde again. He is gone forever." Mr. Utterson frowned. "Do you know where he is?" Jekyll shook his head. "No, and I do not want to know." Then he gave Utterson a letter. "Hyde wrote this," he said. "He has disappeared. He will not come back." Mr. Utterson read the letter. It said that Hyde had escaped and that Jekyll should not worry. Utterson did not trust it. He had a bad feeling. He left Jekyll's house thinking, "This is not over. Something is very wrong." The city was searching for Hyde, but Hyde had vanished. Where had he gone? Chapter 5. Dr. Jekyll is afraid. After the terrible murder of Sir Danvers Carew, Mr. Utterson went to visit Dr. Jekyll. He needed to know if Jekyll was connected to Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll's house was large and beautiful, but behind it was a dark, old laboratory. The building looked abandoned. No one used it anymore, except for Dr. Jekyll. When Utterson arrived, Poole, the servant, opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home?" Utterson asked. Poole nodded. "Yes, sir, but he has not left his room for days." Mr. Utterson walked inside. The house was quiet. He went to Dr. Jekyll's study, a large room filled with books and bottles of strange chemicals. Dr. Jekyll sat in a chair. He looked very sick and tired. His face was pale, and his hands shook. "Jekyll," Utterson said, "what is wrong? You look unwell." Jekyll gave a weak smile. "I am better than I was," he said. "I will be fine soon." "Have you heard the news?" Utterson asked. "Sir Danvers Carew was murdered." Jekyll's face turned white. He looked away. "Yes, I have heard," he said quietly. "It was Hyde," Utterson said. "The police are looking for him. Where is he?" Dr. Jekyll shook his head. "I do not know, but I swear, Utterson, I will never see him again. Hyde is gone forever." The letter. Jekyll stood up and walked to his desk. He took out a piece of paper and gave it to Utterson. "Read this," he said. "Hyde sent me this letter before he disappeared." Utterson took the letter and read it. "Dr. Jekyll, do not worry about me. I am safe. No one will find me. You will not see me again. Hyde." Utterson looked at Jekyll. "So Hyde has escaped?" "Yes," Jekyll said. "And I am happy about it. I am finished with him." Utterson was relieved, but he still had doubts. "Jekyll, I hope this is true. But tell me, how did Hyde disappear so quickly?" Dr. Jekyll hesitated. Then he said, "I do not know, but I do not care. He is gone. and that is all that matters. Utterson was still suspicious. He looked at the letter again. This handwriting looks familiar, he thought. A terrible discovery. Later that day, Utterson visited his clerk, Mr. Guest. Guest was an expert in handwriting. "Guest, I need you to look at this letter," Utterson said. "Tell me what you think." Guest took the letter and studied it carefully. Then he frowned. "This is strange," he said. "The handwriting looks like Dr. Jekyll's." Utterson's heart sank. "Are you sure?" he asked. Guest nodded. "Yes. It is different, but the style is the same. I believe Dr. Jekyll wrote this letter." Utterson was shocked. If Jekyll wrote Hyde's letter, it means... He stopped. He did not want to say it out loud. Did this mean that Dr. Jekyll was helping Hyde? Or was it something even worse? Utterson left the office deep in thought. Jekyll is hiding something, he thought. But what? That night he could not sleep. He knew the mystery was not over. Something dark and terrible was still waiting to be discovered. Chapter 6. Dr. Jekyll changes again. After the disappearance of Mr. Hyde, life seemed better. Dr. Jekyll was happier. He invited friends to his house again. He smiled and laughed like before. Mr. Utterson was relieved. He thought his friend was free from Hyde's evil influence. For 2 months, everything was normal. But then, something changed. One day, Utterson went to visit Dr. Jekyll. Poole, the servant, opened the door. He looked worried. "Is Dr. Jekyll home?" Utterson asked. Poole shook his head. "The doctor will not see anyone." Utterson was surprised. "Why not?" "I do not know, sir," Poole said, "but he stays in his room all day. He does not eat much. He looks very sick." Utterson felt uneasy. "Is he in danger?" "I do not think so, sir," Poole said, "but something is very wrong." Utterson left the house, deep in thought. Why had Jekyll changed again? Dr. Lanyon's fear. A few days later, Mr. Utterson visited Dr. Lanyon, another old friend. But when he saw Lanyon, he was shocked. Lanyon looked very sick. His face was pale. His hands shook. He looked much older. "Lanyon, what happened?" Utterson asked. Lanyon gave a weak smile. "I do not have much time left," he said. "I will die soon." Utterson was shocked. "No, Lanyon, you will get better." Lanyon shook his head. "I know I will die, but that is not the worst part. The worst part is what I have seen." Utterson frowned. "What do you mean?" Lanyon looked afraid. "I cannot tell you. It is too terrible. I have seen something that has changed me forever." "Is it about Dr. Jekyll?" Utterson asked. Lanyon's hands shook more. His eyes filled with fear. "Do not speak to me about Jekyll," he said. "I never want to hear his name again." Utterson was confused and afraid. "But you and Jekyll were good friends," he said. Lanyon sighed. "Not any more. After what I have seen, I can never be his friend again." Utterson did not understand, but he could see that Lanyon was truly terrified. A letter from Lanyon. A few days later, Dr. Lanyon died. Mr. Utterson was very sad, but before he died, Lanyon had written him a letter. Utterson opened the letter. But inside, there was another envelope. On it, Lanyon had written, "Do not open this letter until Dr. Jekyll dies or disappears." Utterson stared at the letter. His hands trembled. What secret is inside? He wondered. What did Lanyon see? For now, he had to wait. Dr. Jekyll's isolation. After Lanyon's death, Utterson went to see Jekyll again. But Poole would not let him in. "The doctor will not see anyone," Poole said. "He has locked himself in his room." Utterson felt helpless. He stood outside Jekyll's house and looked up at the windows. He saw a pale face looking down. It was Dr. Jekyll. But he looked like a prisoner in his own home. Then, suddenly, the window shut. Utterson walked away, his heart heavy. Something was very wrong, and he was going to find out the truth. Chapter 7. A Terrible Sight. One Sunday, Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield went for their usual walk. The weather was cool and pleasant. The streets were quiet. As they walked, they passed the old dark building where Mr. Hyde once lived. The building still looked ugly and abandoned. Mr. Enfield pointed at it. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. Mr. Utterson nodded. "Yes, I have not forgotten." Then they stopped in front of Dr. Jekyll's house. The house was large and beautiful, but something felt strange. The windows were closed. The house was silent. Mr. Enfield looked at one of the windows. "Look, someone is there." Utterson looked up. Dr. Jekyll was sitting at the window. He looked very pale and thin. His face was tired. A short conversation. "Jekyll," Utterson called. "You look sick. Are you all right?" Dr. Jekyll gave a weak smile. "I am not well, my friend, but I am happy to see you." "Come outside and walk with us," Mr. Enfield said. "Some fresh air will do you good." Jekyll shook his head. "No, I cannot. I must stay inside." Utterson frowned. "Why? What are you afraid of?" Jekyll sighed. "I cannot explain, but I am glad you are here. Talking to you makes me feel better." A horrible change. Jekyll smiled at his friends, but suddenly something changed. His smile disappeared. His face twisted in pain. His body shook violently. Then his face changed. Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield stepped back in horror. "What is happening to him?" Enfield whispered. Jekyll made a terrible gasping sound. Then suddenly he slammed the window shut. The two men stood frozen. Their faces were pale. Their hands trembled. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Mr. Utterson whispered, "My God, what did we just see?" Mr. Enfield shook his head. "I do not know, but something is terribly wrong with Jekyll." Without another word, they walked away, their hearts full of fear. Something dark and terrible was happening inside Dr. Jekyll's house, and soon they would learn the truth. Chapter 8. The Last Night. One evening, Poole, Dr. Jekyll's servant, came to Mr. Utterson's house. He looked very afraid. His hands were shaking and his face was pale. "Mr. Utterson, come quickly," Poole said. "Something is wrong at Dr. Jekyll's house." Utterson stood up at once. "What happened?" he asked. The doctor has locked himself in his room for a week, Poole said. He will not come out. He will not see anyone. And, sir, I am afraid. Afraid of what? Utterson asked. Poole looked around nervously. I do not think the man inside is Dr. Jekyll. Utterson felt a chill run down his spine. Take me to the house at once, he said. A house full of fear. Poole and Utterson walked quickly through the cold, dark streets. When they arrived at Dr. Jekyll's house, the servants were waiting in the hallway. They looked terrified. What has happened? Utterson asked. Poole whispered, The doctor never leaves his room. He only speaks through the door. His voice is different, sir. It is not Dr. Jekyll's voice. Utterson's heart beat faster. Have you seen him? Poole shook his head. No, sir. But I have seen something. Sometimes the man inside runs across the room. I saw him once. He was small. And quick. Utterson's face became serious. Mr. Hyde, he whispered. Poole nodded. Yes, sir. I believe Mr. Hyde has killed Dr. Jekyll. Utterson took a deep breath. We must break down the door. Breaking the door, Utterson and Poole picked up an axe. The other servant stood back, too afraid to help. Dr. Jekyll, Utterson called. Open the door. There was no answer. Utterson raised the axe. He hit the door as hard as he could. Bang! The door shook. Bang! The wood started to break. Bang! The lock snapped, and the door flew open. Utterson and Poole rushed inside. A shocking discovery. Inside the room, everything was a mess. Bottles and papers were on the floor. The air smelled strange, but the most terrible sight was on the floor. A small, twisted body lay there. It was Mr. Hyde. He was dead. A bottle was in his hand. He had poisoned himself. Poole gasped. Where is Dr. Jekyll? Utterson looked around the room. There was no sign of Jekyll. Has Hyde killed him? Where is the body? Then they saw a letter on the desk. It was from Dr. Jekyll. It had Utterson's name on it. Utterson picked it up. His hands were shaking. The letter said, My dear Utterson, by the time you read this, I will be gone. But now, you will learn the truth. Beside the letter, there was a large envelope. It contained Dr. Jekyll's full confession. Utterson closed his eyes for a moment. Come, Poole, he said. We must go home and read this letter. We will finally know everything. Poole nodded. He looked at Hyde's dead body one last time. Then they left the room, ready to learn the truth about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Horror. That night, Mr. Utterson sat in his office. He held Dr. Jekyll's letter in his hands. His heart was beating fast. He opened the envelope. Inside, there was another letter. It was from Dr. Lanyon. The letter was written before he died. Utterson took a deep breath and began to read. A strange request. Dr. Lanyon's letter began with a shocking story. My dear Utterson, Lanyon wrote, what I am about to tell you is unbelievable, but I swear every word is true. One night, Lanyon received a letter from Dr. Jekyll. It was urgent. Jekyll begged Lanyon for help. Lanyon, you must do exactly as I say. Go to my house. My servant Poole will be waiting. You must go inside my laboratory and take the drawer from my desk. Inside, there are bottles, powders, and papers. Bring them to your house. At midnight, a man will come to collect them. Do not ask questions. Just do this for me. Lanyon was confused and worried, but Jekyll was his old friend, so he decided to help. A midnight visitor, Lanyon went to Dr. Jekyll's house. Poole was already waiting. The doctor told me you would come, Poole said. Come inside. Lanyon entered the laboratory. The room was dark and cold. Bottles and chemicals were on the shelves. Lanyon found the drawer that Jekyll described. Inside, there were strange powders and a notebook. Lanyon took the drawer and brought it to his own house. At midnight, there was a knock at the door. Lanyon opened the door. A small, ugly man stood outside. His eyes were wild and he looked nervous. Are you Dr. Lanyon? The man asked in a low voice. Lanyon nodded. Yes. And who are you? The man grinned. His smile was cold and unpleasant. That is not important, he said. Did you bring the drawer? Lanyon stepped back. Something about this man felt wrong. But he took the drawer and placed it on the table. The man quickly opened it. He took a bottle and a glass. He poured a liquid into the glass and mixed it with the strange powder. The liquid bubbled and changed color. First red, then purple, then green. Lanyon watched in shock. A horrible transformation. The man picked up the glass and looked at Lanyon. Before I drink this, do you want to leave? He asked. What you see next will change your life forever. Lanyon shook his head. I do not believe in magic, but I want to see what happens. The man laughed softly. Then watch carefully, he said. He lifted the glass and drank the liquid in one gulp. At first, nothing happened. Then suddenly his body started shaking. His face twisted. His bones cracked. He grew taller. His skin changed. Lanyon stared in horror. Before his eyes, the ugly man transformed into Dr. Jekyll. Lanyon jumped back. His heart raced. Impossible, he cried. Jekyll looked at Lanyon. His face was sad. Now you know my terrible secret, Jekyll said. I am both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Lanyon could not speak. His hands shook. His face turned pale. I have seen something unnatural, he wrote. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I know I will die soon. But before I go, I want you, Utterson, to know the truth. Utterson's fear. Utterson finished the letter. His hands were trembling. Jekyll and Hyde are the same person, he whispered. Now he understood everything. Jekyll had created a drug. It turned him into Mr. Hyde. That is why Hyde had disappeared. But what had happened to Jekyll? Utterson picked up the second letter from Jekyll. Now, I must read the final confession, he thought. The horrible truth was waiting for him. Chapter 10. Dr. Jekyll's Confession. Mr. Utterson sat alone in his office. He held Dr. Jekyll's final letter in his hands. His heart beat fast. This letter would finally reveal the truth. He took a deep breath and began to read. Dr. Jekyll's story, I, Henry Jekyll, am writing this letter before I die. This is my full confession. Now, you will know everything. Dr. Jekyll was always two people. Inside him, there was a good man and a bad man. As a doctor, he was respected and kind, but deep inside, he had dark desires. He wanted to do things that were wrong, but he could not. Society expected him to be a gentleman, so he hid his bad side. One day, he had an idea. What if I could separate my good side from my bad side? He began to experiment in his laboratory. He mixed chemicals. He created a special potion. If I drink this, will I become only my bad self? He wondered. One night, he drank the potion. The birth of Mr. Hyde. At first, he felt terrible pain. His body twisted. His bones cracked, his skin burned. Then the pain stopped. He looked in the mirror. He was shorter. His hands were thinner. His face was evil. He was Mr. Hyde. This is amazing, he thought. Now, as Hyde, he could do whatever he wanted. No one would recognize him. He was free. He walked through the city. He pushed people in the street. He stole from shops. He hurt others without feeling guilty. It felt exciting, and when he drank the potion again, he became Dr. Jekyll once more. Now I can live two lives, he thought. By day I will be Jekyll. At night I will be Hyde. But soon, things went wrong. Hyde becomes stronger. At first, Jekyll controlled Hyde. He only became Hyde when he chose to. But one morning, he woke up feeling strange. His hands were thinner. His face was different. He ran to the mirror. He was Hyde. He had not drunk the potion, yet he had changed. "No," he whispered. "I am losing control." He quickly drank the potion again. He turned back into Jekyll. From that moment, he was afraid. Hyde was becoming stronger. Jekyll was becoming weaker. The murder of Sir Danvers Carew. Jekyll tried to stop becoming Hyde. For 2 months, he lived a good life. But one day, he felt weak. He missed the excitement of Hyde. One more time, he thought. Just once. He drank the potion again. He felt powerful. He laughed. He walked into the city, looking for trouble. That night, he met Sir Danvers Carew. The old man was kind and polite. He smiled at Hyde. But Hyde felt angry for no reason. His hands shook. His heart raced. And then, he killed Carew. Jekyll was horrified. He ran back home and destroyed the key to Hyde's house. "I must stop this forever," he said. He promised to never drink the potion again. The final transformation. For some weeks, Jekyll lived in peace. But then one day, something terrible happened. He was sitting in the park, thinking about his life. Suddenly, he felt pain. His body twisted. His hands changed. He had become Hyde, without drinking the potion. No, this cannot be, he thought. People on the street looked at him in fear. He ran away. He knew the police were looking for Hyde. He could not escape. "I must drink the potion again," he thought. "I must become Jekyll." He ran home. But when he opened the drawer, he felt terror. The special chemical was finished. He could not make more. "I am trapped as Hyde forever." The end of Dr. Jekyll. Hyde was hunted. He could not go outside. He hid inside the laboratory, afraid. He wrote his final confession. "I am Dr. Jekyll," he wrote. But soon Hyde will take over completely. He picked up poison. He knew what he must do. He drank the poison and died. The mystery is solved. Utterson finished reading. He sat in silence. Now he knew everything. Dr. Jekyll had created a monster inside himself. He had lost control. And in the end, Hyde destroyed them both. Utterson closed the letter. Poor Jekyll, he whispered. He was his own worst enemy. The story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had finally ended.